Good morning, everybody. Fergus Dolan here from NALA. You're very welcome to our webinar this morning on applying phonics to ESOL lessons. And we're delighted to have Michelle McGrain facilitating this morning. Hi, Michelle.
Morning, everybody.
Michelle is the ESOL Literacy Provision Coordinator with Dublin and Dunleary ETB, based mainly in the west of the county. And my colleague Michelle Reid is helping this morning. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, everyone.
So Michelle's helping me with admin, etc. So so Michelle McGrain suggested that if you've questions, so during the presentation, if you have questions, type them into the chat box, and at the end we'll try and get to them all. And also at the end, when she finishes the presentation, you can also unmute and ask Michelle questions. So I'll hand over to you, Michelle, and all the best.
Great. Okay, good morning, everybody. So this webinar is about applying phonics to ESOL lessons. I'm going to be talking about phonics, what it is, also how it can be used for our ESOL learners, some of the different strategies and the case for and against it, and what the advantages and disadvantages might be. And at the end, I'm going to be just also offering a few examples of how it can be taught in a classroom situation. So just to mention as well that I've also included in this PowerPoint presentation, which I think Fergus is going to be sharing with everybody afterwards, that my address is also there. I'm absolutely delighted to receive emails from anybody who's interested in this particular area, and quite happy to talk to anybody about sharing materials or methods or training or anything like that. I do deliver training as well, so if anybody's interested, that's just another option. So during this little webinar this morning, we'll be talking about some of the challenges. In order to understand, I suppose, the solution, you do need to have some sense of the problems. I probably won't spend a lot of time on that, since all of you are already practitioners and therefore will have pretty good understanding of the challenges inherent already. I will talk a little bit about phonics, what it is, the theory behind it, the principles underpinning it, some of the skills that are involved, and also some of the techniques for how you can actually use it in the classroom. So I'm going to begin with maybe a very obvious statement, but just to explain that when we talk about phonics, we're talking about a reading methodology, a way of teaching people to read. We all know now that many of the ESOL learners who are coming into our classrooms do not have adequate, or in some cases do not have any reading skills. And so this presents with a fairly massive challenge, as it makes traditional methods of teaching English quite difficult. And I think we can all agree that being able to read is a fairly fundamental and essential skill. So it's really very important that we address that. This little part, I've just called it Teaching is Hard, because you may not be aware, or you may, that English is in fact an extremely difficult language to learn. So I'm just going to talk about that just a little bit now. Okay, and I've divided it into three parts, which is the challenges to the practitioners, that's us, the tutors, the challenges to the learner, and the challenges to organizations. So one of the things I would ask you to do is, as I just go through these quite quickly, because I think maybe it's stuff that you possibly are already aware of, I would love you to, I wouldn't mind if you maybe wrote a few notes in the chat about other challenges that I may have forgotten to include that you may be aware of. So with regards to tutors often find themselves feeling a little bit ill-equipped when they come to a learner who has no reading skills, or very, very limited reading skills whatsoever. We tend to historically use, reading materials, pictures, things like that, and so it can be quite difficult. Another challenge is that we often don't have good diagnostic and assessment materials. And so it can be quite difficult to ascertain exactly what the level of a very low learner is, and also to establish where the problem is if a person is struggling to learn how to read. In a practical situation, we are invariably working with groups. There are very few of us now who have the luxury of working one-to-one with a learner. And so if you are finding that one or two of your learners are not progressing, that creates kind of a stressful situation if everybody else is moving forward and, you know, one or two learners are not moving forward. I'm going to talk briefly about the difficulties of moving from the early code to what's called the advanced code. And just to be clear, there are a number of different terminologies around this because phonics programs have been developed all over the world. So they've been developed in pretty much every English-speaking country, Australia, America, and so on, and Britain, Ireland, so on. The different terms essentially all refer to the fact that there is a sort of two-tiered system when we are teaching reading of English language. We have the very simple first part, which basically is a sort of one letter, one sound match. So we teach the, CVCs, words like and those are make quite a lot of sense, and students can kind of embrace them quite quickly. And then when I talk about the advanced code, which is sometimes called the complex code or the later code, there's different terminology. We're talking about moving on to the more complex part of the English language, where we have, for example, maybe I think there's about sort of 10 or 11 different spellings, for example, for the A sound. And not only that, but the same spelling can be used for different sounds, and it gets quite complicated. And a lot of learners quickly embrace the early code, the first bit. And if I can just say from my own experience as well, that this is equally true of children and adults, that they can quickly embrace the first part. But when it comes to making that leap from that first sort of more obvious logical bit to the second less obvious stage, that is where they run into problems and difficulties. And another challenge that is faced by tutors, any of you who have tried to teach reading to adults will already be familiar with this. There's quite a deficit of appropriate materials. So if you Google phonics, there are thousands and thousands of phonics websites, thousands and thousands of worksheets, materials, lots and lots of lovely stuff, but it's very, very child oriented. And there is very little in the line of suitable materials at that very, very basic level. So that's a challenge. For our learners, they are faced with also another battery of challenges. For example, they have to come into a class where they may not be working with the same teacher all the time. You might have Mary on Monday and Jane on Wednesday, and Mary might be using one particular method, while Jane might be using a different method. And each teacher is obviously, with the very best will in the world and with the best of intentions, bringing every bit of skill, knowledge, and energy to teaching that learner. Nonetheless, we rarely have a cohesive program which basically all teachers are following. That rarely happens at this very low level reading point. So for example, you will have some teachers who will say something like, say, for example, the letter C, and they might say, C says K. Now, C is a letter, it's a squiggle on a board, and it doesn't actually say anything because it's a visual representation of a sound. And so even that use of, that way of saying it, C says K, is can be confusing. Teachers and tutors are inclined to try and give meaning where none exists. So they try to create tricks and tips. So they say, well, when it's at the end of the word or when it's at the beginning of the word, it's this spelling or that spelling, or I before E except after C, or the magic E. The problem with all of these little tricks and different sort of ways of teaching is that they are rarely universally true. There's usually lots and lots of exceptions. And in fact, sometimes the exceptions actually outnumber the rule, which renders it, certainly in my opinion anyway, less than helpful. The English language is very opaque. and many other languages are far more transparent. I just want to talk about those two words for a minute. Many of you may already be familiar with those, but just to explain for those who may not, a transparent language is a language where there is one spelling for every sound. And those languages exist. Unfortunately, English is not one. And so the more transparent a language is, the easier it is to learn how to read. And the more opaque a language is, the more difficult it is to learn how to read. So if you have a situation like English, where there are many, many, many different spellings for the same sounds, and equally spellings which carry lots of different sounds, and you have 26 letters in the alphabet, but you actually have about 44 sounds, so we don't even have a letter for every sound in our language, and about 176 different graphemes. A grapheme is the spelling, to cover those 44 sounds, you start to get an idea of why English is actually a particularly difficult language to learn, more difficult than many. As if all of that wasn't bad enough, our adults will have unlearned certain things, or will have learned, if you like, things, habits, so to speak, that are not helpful when it comes to learning a language or when it comes to learning reading. For example, the brain, the human brain, is very efficient. So what happens is when we are born, we can basically hear every sound. But if we are listening to a language, whatever language we happen to grow up with, our ear becomes accustomed, acclimatized to those particular sounds, and loses the ability, in the interests of efficiency, to hear sounds that are not used or heard in that language. So by the time you reach adulthood, your ear cannot actually hear all of the sounds that exist. So when you encounter a new language, which you have not encountered before, that language may contain sounds which you simply cannot either hear or differentiate between. And so every language carries some differences. And so some of you might be familiar with, for example, I know that learners whose first language was Chinese, for example, have difficulty with the l and the sound, because in their language, they don't need to differentiate between those two sounds. So they've kind of lost that a little bit. Or certain of the sort of Eastern European countries, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, those countries, for example, those learners struggle to differentiate between the v and the w sound, since that ability is not really necessary in their language. However, it is for English. So that is a problem in terms of hearing. Also, sounds can become what we call glued sounds. That simply means that we're so used to talking. Obviously, when we speak, we blend our sounds together. And so we're so used to hearing those sounds together that we cannot actually identify the sounds as separate, discrete sounds. In fact, this week I've been testing some of my learners, and an example of this would be where I might say, what is the last sound of these words? And I would give a word which contains three sounds. So I would say a word like pet, p-e-t, pet. But what the learner will invariably give me will be et. Okay. Equally, if that's actually two sounds, and t. Okay. Equally, if I ask for the first sound, they will probably give me pe, which is actually two sounds, p and e. And so it can be quite difficult to sort of backtrack and segment those sounds into discrete sounds. And that's actually a skill which sometimes creates a roadblock if the learner is not able to do it. It's called segmenting. And if the learner cannot segment, that is one of the things that may make it difficult as they move forward in reading. And as if all of that wasn't difficult enough, adults, of course, have to deal with real life, which invariably means a plethora of commitments, problems. Many of our learners would have social issues, social problems. They might have financial issues. They often have jobs, families, scheduling issues, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, when you consider all of these different issues together, I think we can say that they really are facing quite a lot of challenges. For an organization, there are also challenges. So if you look at the ETBs or any of the adult education organizations, they basically have to deal with their own collection of challenges, including current theories and the trend. It's almost like a fashion of which theories are popular. Okay. There was a period of time there for about 2 decades. I'm very old, so I've had time to watch the trends, where phonics was quite literally out of fashion. And a lot of proponents, education experts, and sort of people like that were writing articles explaining the pitfalls and challenges around phonics. And so there was a huge um, pressure on organizations not to include phonics in their organizational program development. We're actually seeing a move in the other direction now, which I think is good, which is kind of embracing more phonics. And, for that reason, we're probably going to see more phonics-based programs over the next couple of decades. But again, those are the type of issues which sometimes organizations have to deal with. For example, there was a whole period of time where the word phonics was essentially associated with the Jolly Phonics program. So when people said phonics, everybody thought of Jolly Phonics because Jolly Phonics was what was being used in the vast majority of primary schools in Ireland. So when people said phonics, that's what they thought of. And so the problem there was people immediately thought of all the lovely colorful pictures and Sammy the Snake and, the songs and the dances that went along with that. And so there was a natural and legitimate fear that phonics must be completely inappropriate for adults, that adults would not like this. They wouldn't appreciate it. They would feel that that was demeaning, unacceptable, and that phonics would essentially simply not translate to an adult classroom. Of course, the problem there is that people were misinterpreting the meaning of phonics because that is just one way to teach phonics. Obviously, that has been adapted for children. Jolly Phonics is a great program, but it's clearly designed for children. There's no reason in the world why phonics cannot be taught to adults in an adult appropriate way. And I will be showing you some materials which will hopefully explain that a little bit more. Additionally, we don't have enough structured programs around this area. Perhaps that is a little bit subjective, maybe my opinion, but I challenge anybody to tell me I'm wrong. There are very few structured, strategic programs, certainly very few certified programs, QQI level 1, which are very, very focused on the nuts and bolts of reading. And by the nuts and bolts, I mean knowing the sounds, knowing the ability to blend sounds, decode, and all of that knowledge, which is quite a wealth of knowledge for a person to lead. And then, of course, we have all the logistical issues. We have literacy service on one side, and ESOL service might be a separate part. It could have different ALOs, could be in different locations, class sizes, and we're all under huge pressure at the moment to pack people into classes because ESOL learners, the population is very high. Funding is always an issue, planning is always an issue, scheduling, tutors, all of those practical issues. And so when we put all of those together, it's reasonable to say that the whole job of teaching English in Ireland, and specifically teaching reading, and in particular teaching reading to people who maybe can't speak English or at all or very well, is a big job. It's a big job. A few more reasons, just a few more things, just to sort of examples as to why teaching English in particular is difficult. And if we take, for example, lots of different ways to say a sound. So, for example, if you consider a sound like sh, okay, and many teachers will show the SH spelling, and they will say, this is our spelling for the sound sh. And then, of course, we all know that that's actually not the only spelling. So if you look at the words below here, so you can see we have shark, but then in the word action, there's a different spelling, mission, SS, social, CI, chef, CH, and sure, S on its own. You've probably already taught your learner that S is a spelling for the sound. Now you have to say, well, sometimes it's a spelling for the sound sh. So there is a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn. And one of the problems I feel that tutors almost feel, and is a very natural, if I can just speak sort of from my own experience, it's a very natural desire, is an attempt to kind of try and simplify a language in order to make it easier for the learner to consume, to make it sort of manageable. And the problem is that there are so many exceptions then to those simple rules that it actually creates frustration in the long run. So it's not actually the best thing. The best thing is just to say, this is a spelling for sh, but also sometimes this is a spelling for sh, also sometimes this one, also this, and so on. And then if you go the other way and you look at a letter like O, and you will see that O carries many different sounds. If you listen to the words like ox, go, or, now, to, book, in every single one of these words, the letter O is carrying a different sound. So we basically have one sound being represented by lots of different spellings. And then we also have one spelling representing lots of different sounds. And that is the kind of difficulty of the English language. Not only that, but then sometimes words are pronounced slightly differently. So for example, if we look at the word like, okay, so cat, we have a, gate as in 8, okay? But then if you look at a word like Annie, in some accents, people will say more like any, you know? And so there's also accents and pronunciation issues and just very, very, very messy. You know, I would love to spend a whole morning just talking about the difficulties inherent in the English language, but I hope that what I have done here is just to give you a little taste of why the subject matter, that is to say English reading, is quite a challenging undertaking. A few statistics just to support this point. So each of these bars, and I know that you may not be able to see the writing at the end, I'll just zoom in a second, but each of these bars represent the amount of a particular language that a learner, a child usually, in primary school can read at the end of 1 year of primary education. And so the very first one is actually Finnish. And you can see that at the end of 1 year of education, primary school education, most Finnish children can read most of the Finnish language. Okay, now I'm going to challenge you to guess what the last one is, the lowest one. You maybe won't be shocked when I tell you that it is English. Okay, so the average child at the end of 1 year of primary education will have learned how to read approximately 30% of the English language. Okay, now that has nothing to do with intelligence levels. That is an average across the board, across the world. And the reason very simply for that is that English is a much more difficult language to learn. Reading of English, and I'm speaking specifically here about reading, not speaking, although they often go in tandem with each other. It's simply a harder language to learn. And so the average child takes about 2 to 3 years to learn how to read English. It's just harder. Consider then a group where you are possibly teaching your students for 2 hours per week, and do the maths. How long is it going to take them, take them to learn how to read? And the challenges become quite obvious. Even sadder than this, and I find this particular slide very sad, is how this sort of can be how this translates for different groups. So what we're looking at here is the Welsh language and the English language. The Welsh language, far more transparent, far easier to learn, okay? And what we're looking at here is how the first percentile, at the first quarter, 25% of students, so that would be the highest level, the highest ability, the highest performing, the highest intelligent children, And as you can see, the difference is it's not too much. So if children are fairly intelligent, fairly good at learning how to read, if they basically are quite good at picking things up, the odds are that they're going to be able to pick up English regardless of whether, they're going to be able to pick up reading regardless of whether they're learning to read Welsh or English. But if we go to the lowest quartile, so that is the lowest 25% of children, the children who have the greatest amount of learning difficulty, the children whose performance is at the lowest, you will see that for those children, the difference is quite significant, and it's much easier for those children to learn a transparent language for Welsh than an opaque language. So basically what we're saying here is that if somebody has any difficulty with reading, if they have any difficulty with picking up the language, if they have any difficulty which is going to make it more difficult for them to read, then the odds are very much against them when it comes to learning how to read the English language. Those are the people who are going to encounter the roadblocks. Those are the people who are going to fall behind. And those are the people who will then walk into our classrooms as adults, having been left behind or having struggled or having tried many, many times to learn how to read. They're the ones that have the difficulty. Okay. So I've used the word phonics 100 times, so I am going to talk now for a couple of minutes about what phonics is. Obviously, I can't give a full explanation of phonics, but I just want to give a little kind of a bullet point overview of what phonics is. So to be clear, phonics is one way of teaching reading. It is one teaching methodology. And in my opinion, and there are, even within phonics, there are kind of subdivisions. There's synthetic phonics and analytic phonics, which I cannot go into today, the ins and outs of. But in my experience, and I've now been kind of experimenting on my students now for about 20 years, certainly for about sort of 10 or 15 years in a more strategic and kind of, gathering data and whatnot way. There's no doubt in my mind that utilizing synthetic phonics approaches for learners produces results more quickly, more efficiently, more effectively, and the students themselves, the feedback is very positive. They don't say this is boring. They don't say this is babyish. What they say is, please, can we have more of this? This is great. I finally feel that I'm getting somewhere. So I just want to give a little bit of background about phonics. Okay, so you may have heard the term the reading wars. The reading wars is a phrase which refers to the fact that there has been a lot of backing and forthing over roughly the last 70 to 100 years, a lot of backing and forthing about what is the best way to teach reading. And essentially, we could say that the argument was between two key areas, which have been loosely defined as whole word approaches and phonics approaches. And to be clear, I'm not for a minute suggesting that this is a comprehensive explanation of this, but I'm briefly sort of dividing it into those two. Whole word is probably what many of you, certainly if you're my age or older, will have experienced in school, which is about looking at the word and then learning by rote, House, house. If you got 10 spellings every night when you went home, or if you had to learn your spellings and you had a spelling test on Friday, that was whole word learning, okay? And that was very popular in the 70s in Ireland and kind of into the 80s. Then there was a move back to the phonics approach. And if you've had children in the last 20 years, you'll be familiar with the phonics approach because of Jolly Phonics. And you may have noticed your children coming home saying things like b, e, d, instead of naming the letters B-E-D, and those children are learning through phonics. So that is kind of in a nutshell the different approaches. I suppose if anybody is interested and if anybody wants to email me, I have a number of articles which kind of outline some of the pros and cons, the advantages, the history, and what went on, and the implications and impacts of those debates. But it's just worth knowing that there has been a debate, and it is not a given that one way or the other way is better. Although I personally would be an advocate of using phonics, and I do find that it is working with my learners. One of the problems with the whole word approach was that there was some levels of misinterpretation. And one of the misinterpretations of it was that phonics became associated with kind of babyish materials, you know, like the cat sat on the mat, whereas whole word became associated with appropriate, authentic materials, get your learner to bring in their newspaper, that kind of thing. And that wasn't really, in my opinion, a fair association, because I believe that phonics can be used in an appropriate way to adults, certainly in the long run, and certainly if it's done strategically. And equally, I don't think that, you know, sitting down with a learner who doesn't know any sounds whatsoever and trying to read the newspaper, I don't know if you've ever tried to do that, but it's not as helpful or for the learner as you might think. The downside of whole word learning, we can sum it up in sort of these 3 points. This is very brief. Please excuse the brevity because of time. But the first problem, I suppose, is that it only really works if you actually can speak English or the language that you're learning. So it relies heavily on things like context cues, pictures, what do you think is going to happen next, concluding, you know, sort of using the context clues of the rest of the sentence. But if you actually don't know the English language and you don't know the meaning of the words, you're a bit scuppered there. The second problem is that there are about 50,000 words, whole words in common English discourse. That's not even all the words in the language. That's just the ones that you need for kind of everyday conversation. And so that's a hell of a lot of things to remember. It's a hell of a lot of words. And I have regularly worked with the learners who have started at the beginning and who felt that they were getting somewhere. They were feeling quite optimistic and positive. And they reach a point where they literally say to me, I can't remember anymore. Like, it's almost like my brain is full. So they almost feel that they actually have to literally remember every single word individually, rather than having I'll just go back to the previous number, which I presented with you, which is 176 spellings. Now, 176 might seem like a lot of spellings to have to learn, but when you compare it to 50,000 whole words, it starts to become clear that maybe it's not so impossible. And the final problem with whole word learning is that it doesn't really give any tools or equip a student to try or have a go or have a bash at a word that they've never seen before. So it basically relies very heavily on memory. And if you have never seen the word before or never encountered the word, you kind of have no way to decode it or decipher it or kind of guess what it might mean. It leaves you somewhat limited in that regard. On the other side, the synthetic phonics approach has a number of strengths. It is sequential. So you teach this, then you teach this, then you teach this, then you teach this. Essentially, you begin with what are called CVCs, which is a consonant, vowel, consonant word, like man, dog, cat. You then move on to CVCCs, a word like held, hand. Then you move on to your CVCs, which is words like frog. You move on to your CCVCs, which is frost. You keep building. Then you moved on to 2-syllable words, then 3-syllable words. I forgot to put compound words should be in there. And then you basically start to learn the more advanced level, which is all the spellings for I, all the spellings for E. So there's a very systematic, there's literally a procedure, you know, a way of teaching. It's so that's important. It's diagnostic. And by diagnostic, I mean that the approach helps to identify what is causing the problem. So if you have a learner in a class who is not moving forward, you can do a little kind of an assessment and you can figure out where the problem lies. What is holding up this learner? What's the problem? an example of this would be, for example, that the vast majority of learners can blend almost intuitively. Blending is when you take two sounds and push them together. We do it all the time. So, ah, two discrete sounds. How do we blend them? Ma. In a classroom situation, if you say ah, the odds are quite a lot of students will almost automatically be able to say ma. Pretty much happens intuitively. But there are a small cohort of students who simply can't. And I've worked with the learners who just go ah, ma, ah, ah, ah. And they just can't do that little blend of pushing it together. And they need an extra bit of help with that. But if you haven't identified that as the problem, well, then you won't be able to work on it. So, that's what I mean when I say diagnostic. Systematic. Every skill that the learner learns at one level will be needed and used at the next level. So each level prepares them for the next level. So there isn't that going back and going back. You don't have to do a lot of revision because each level is basically has a revision inherent in it. It's intrinsically it's all integrated. It's reversible, by which I mean that as you are learning to read, you are also learning to write. As you are learning to write, you are also learning to read. So it isn't a case of we do one first and then the other. They're happening in tandem. And I would actually go a little step further and say that speaking, pronunciation, and listening skills are also happening in tandem. Although I don't have quite as many statistics to bear that up, but I can tell you from my own personal experience that that has proved to be the case, sort of anecdotally. And it's clutter-free and focused, by which I mean that it's literally teaching just this. And, not a lot of other kind of bells and whistles. There's no extra tricks or special funny things. So I've been talking now for a very, very long time about how to teach a word. And so for a moment, I just want you to stop and think about what exactly is involved in teaching a word. What do I mean when I say reading a word? Sorry, to be more clear, how to read a word. And I'm going to use this little story because this actually happened to me anecdotally, where I had the experience of a very, very beginner learner, and I was writing the word milk on the word. Now, if you look on this screen right now, you can see that milk. It's actually even quite difficult to figure out which of these is the word milk. Because it would be quite difficult to figure out which ones are even letters. But I had written the word milk, and the student thought that I was trying to draw a picture of an udder. So they thought that the word milk represented the word milk because in some way was similar to the picture of an udder. So they did not actually realize that milk was 4 sounds, that those 4 that those 4 sounds were represented by 4 individual squiggles that we call letters, and that each of those individual squiggles had to be written in a certain way, a certain order, and that you then had to say those 4 sounds. They were unaware of any of that. And I simply want to point that out because we tend to forget. We're so used to the way that our language is designed that we tend to forget that that is not information which is given or that is known by all. So, in fact, what is required to read a word? Well, what do you need to understand? You need to understand that when I say the word milk, 4 distinct, discrete sounds are actually going to come out of my mouth. I, l. Those 4 sounds are spoken in succession, but we do not say them as 4 individual sounds. We blend them. So when I say milk, I don't say ilka. I say milk. Okay. Then each of those 4 sounds has a squiggle, otherwise known as a spelling, in this case letters, 4 individual letters, which have been arbitrarily applied to those sounds to represent those sounds. And the only way to know those sounds is to learn them. The only way to know the arbitrary symbols, the spellings, which represent those sounds is to learn them. There is no other way. So there's no kind of logic to it. You know, the letter M only represents the sound because somebody has agreed that that's what we're going to use. And so those are represented in visual symbols. Those four representative symbols in our language are written from left to right, and we write them in the order that they are pronounced. So we write first, then I, then L. Okay. And in order to read, you have to read them in the order that they are written. You have to read from left to right, and you have to blend them. You cannot say the four sounds independently. So you need to have the ability to recognize them. You need to have the ability to blend them. Otherwise, you can't read. All right. So here's synthetic phonics in a nutshell. Written language is an arbitrary representation in symbolic code of a spoken language. The word arbitrary is important here. Deep reading, and by deep reading, I mean the ability to decode words, including words that you've never seen before, including 2-syllable, 3-syllable complex words, involves the ear as well as the eye. Hence the word phonics. Phonics, like the word phone or phoneme or phonic or phonetic, is associated with the ear, not the eye. And so being able to hear the sounds and blend the sounds and segment the sounds with your ear is absolutely crucial. And we teach that first. So learners in my classroom are listening to blending of sounds before they even see the sounds in a visual representation. I'm just going to say that again because that's how important it is. We go from the sounds to the letters, not the other way around. Okay. We can essentially say that there are five principles underpinning this method of learning. Five principles, if you like, that our learners need to understand. So, as I've already said, they need to understand that words are sequences of individual sounds. So a word is not a sound. A word is actually a number of sounds blended together. Those sounds are represented by spellings. A spelling can be more than one letter. So a spelling could have 2 letters, 3 letters, or even 4 letters. Think of the word 8, and the sound A is represented by E-I-G-H. Those are the first 3 principles, and they essentially are the foundation. And then the second 2 principles are all about why English is horrible, which is basically that a sound can be spelled in more than one way. And equally, a spelling can carry more than one sound. So they can sound the same but look different, and they can look the same but sound different. I must just briefly tell you about, it's a little bit funny, but I was recently working with a student, and we were working through some of these spellings, and she literally stopped for a moment and she just said to me, "Who?" And although she didn't quite have enough English to explain her frustration, I knew that what she wanted to ask me was, who invented this language? Whose idea was this? You know, who made this up? It's ridiculous. It's crazy. And I sort of very briefly tried to explain. I said, well, there were countries, and then they spoke, and then they moved to other countries, and you know, it's kind of over years. Then people changed, and then they added bits, and they took bits away, and everything like that. You know, she listened carefully, and she just said to me, "It is a very bad plan." You know, and I had to agree with her. I said, it's a very bad plan. And then she said to me, she said, "I suppose it is too late." And what she was saying was basically, it's too late to change it now because everybody speaks English. It's too late to try and design a simpler one or fix it. And essentially, what she was experiencing there is, I suppose, the truth of what we all have to deal with, which is that we're kind of stuck with this language. English is not going anywhere, and in order to be able to access, you know, our society or function in our society, you need to know how to read it, but you also need to be aware of the fact that it's incredibly complicated and difficult and doesn't make a lot of sense. Quite a logical language. There are 4 skills involved in the phonics approach, which are viewed as kind of the essential skills for reading. And they are phoneme recognition, blending, segmenting, and sound switching. And I would suggest to you that if you have a learner who is having a difficulty reading, there's quite a good chance that this is where the problem is. Not always, but this may be where the problem lies. Phoneme recognition literally means the ability to hear and recognize a sound. An example is, if I say the word sad, what was the first sound that came out of my mouth? And if your learner can say, that's phoneme recognition, okay? Blending is the ability to take the three sounds then and blend them together and push them together, and I've already spoken about that. Segmenting is quite literally the opposite. So if I say a word like sad, can you actually identify that sad is three sounds? S, a, d. And sound switching is crucial for that move to the more advanced words, because sound switching is about trying out different sounds in a word. So for example, looking at the word g, say for example, we'll say the word like gate, okay? And essentially what we want here is for the learner to try all the possible sounds. It could be ga, te, it could be g, a, t, okay? And so what we want the learner to be able to do is kind of play around with the different sounds and try to figure out which one is the word. And that is an essential part of more advanced reading when they start coming to words that they may not know. So those are the skills. Now, as ESOL learners, we essentially have two choices. Sorry, I said ESOL learners, I meant teachers, tutors. As tutors, we have two sort of options. One is to systematically teach phonics, start at the very, very, very beginning with our CVCs, man. And the other one is to use the more traditional methods that we may already be using and try to integrate phonics into those lessons. And just to say to you today that I'm not here really to say one or the other one is better. I'm simply saying that there are two different options. However, I am going to just mention some of the kind of advantages and disadvantages of both sides. I don't think it's a shock to anybody if I say that I'm a big advocate of phonics. So, we will take that as read. However, I'm fully aware of the fact that there are many other useful tools and approaches in teaching ESOL. If we look at the systematic program based on phonics methods, that is to say that I'm going to teach my learner in much the same way as a child is being taught in primary school now, but using adult appropriate materials. So they're beginning by learning the sounds, how to put the sounds together into words, how to build those sounds, longer words, and so on. My experience is that this is excellent, especially for the absolute beginners in reading. It's a very sequential system, which means that the tutors feel equipped. So they're not going into a classroom going, I don't know what I'm going to do with them today. They're going in going, today we're on this step. This is the next step. And next week we're doing that step. And it is possible to include other elements of ESOL. I'm going to take just a moment to talk about this. One of the big criticisms, which is regularly levied at myself when I'm talking about this, and phonics in general, is that the problem with phonics is that it doesn't allow the learner to gain any meaning. So it's almost as though the words are being learned in a vacuum without understanding the meaning of the words. Equally, it doesn't address many of the other issues about literacy. So let's talk about things like grammar, punctuation, capital letters, and all those sorts of things. I would suggest that it's absolutely possible, and I know this to be true, to integrate all of those things in a phonics-based program. So a phonics-based program doesn't have to be exclusively phonics. It simply has to be phonics-based. That is to say that the order of teaching is CVC followed by CCVC followed by CCVC, and then building the words to bigger words, okay? The downsides, it can take a lot of time. And if you have a group of 15 students with mixed abilities, 2 hours a week, it's going to be very difficult to get very far with a phonics-based approach, especially if they have different levels and some can read and some can't. So from a practical point of view, it can be difficult in certain contexts. Also, with very large groups, I have found it's quite difficult. It doesn't lend itself well to very large groups, very large ESOL groups. And we at the DDLETB are under a lot of pressure, and I don't think we're unique in this regard, to take large numbers of learners at the moment, especially now since sort of Ukraine and things like that. And so, you know, in many cases, class sizes are larger, and so that presents with a problem. So if we look at the other way, which is to integrate phonics into a regular ESOL lesson, for want of a better word, it allows tutors to include the phonics methods while they are using other methodologies. And also the tutor is not restricted to the sequence, which tends to be applied with phonics. So for example, they can teach the word coat, which might be more relevant and meaningful and important to the learner, before they teach the word zip. Whereas with the phonics approach, you might find yourself teaching the word zip simply because it is a phonically simpler word to decode before you teach the word coat. And you might find yourself teaching the word bank before you teach the word school, but maybe you need to know the word school before bank. And so there's a question there about the order of teaching and the prioritizing around that. The downside of not using a phonics-based method, in my opinion, is that students with lower literacy levels struggle to absorb the vast array of information that's being thrown at them in a relatively non-sequential way. And it is those learners who tend to get left behind. And those are the learners that you'll find attending classes for sort of a maybe class after class after class after class, and don't seem to be really moving forward. They're not progressing. Those are the ones I'm talking about. Okay. Now that is the end of the little PowerPoint presentation. What I'm going to do now is just show, I suppose, a very quick snapshot example of materials that are both of the different ways that I mentioned there. Okay. One is I'm going to show some examples of materials which are a phonics-based approach. Okay. So that is to say that these materials, I'm using them in a phonics-based program that I'm using. Okay. This is for module 1, very, very, very beginning. So what you can see here in this worksheet, can everybody see the worksheet? Yeah, the worksheet's okay. Just nod if you can see it. Yeah? Okay, great. And so in the worksheet, what you can see is that we have chosen CVC words. Okay. We then move on. We're teaching plurals here. You can see that we're teaching one and then more than one. And so I'm using words which are initially CVC. And I'm choosing those. And then we're building to CVCC words. And so you might find yourself teaching a word like frog. You might say, is that really important in the first month? Well, it's a CVC word. So that's kind of the whole point. Okay. Now I have integrated my workshops with sort of little bits of grammar. So for example, we have a, we have s, you know, in this worksheet, for example, that's just an example. So we have plurals and singular. And then I have also kind of designed additional little bits at the end with sentences, you know, with capital letters, with full stop. So it's definitely possible to integrate language elements. Okay, I'm just going to share another example of that. Okay, and so this example is, if you like, an adult friendly, but very, very, very basic. So you can see that there are sentences. Okay, we have Ted is a dad, Dan is a vet. You get the idea. Okay, Bear fed the cat. So they're relatively, and I've tried to use different ethnicities and different genders and, you know, things like that. So that a little bit of humor as well there. The dog bit the cat. We talk about whether the cat is happy about this. Okay. So, you know, but it's not patronizing. It's not demeaning, but it's clearly very much step by step. Okay. An example of the other way of teaching is if you have a piece of material that you already use, and I here am going to use the page from the Big Picture, which is a great resource from NALA. Okay. And this particular lesson is about asking for a library card. And I have chosen this one page from the book. The lesson is all about the library. Okay. And so, as you can see, there are about 10 sentences there. So what I've actually done is a little analysis of that lesson. I'm just going to share that with you now. Okay. And in this case, this is me preparing a lesson. This would require a certain degree of knowledge about, I suppose, what you've already done with the learner. But what I've done here is I've listed all of the sentences. This is me kind of preparing all of the sentences from that lesson. And I've picked out the spellings in those lessons that the learner already knows. I know this because I've kept a record. And the spellings that maybe we've never come across before. As an example, the use of the letter S as a spelling for the sound Z, as opposed to the S sound. And I've listed some examples here. Is, has, his. Okay. So this is my little preparation that I do. It's a little analysis of a piece of writing. This is just one example of many. And then this is how I deliver the lesson. So first of all, we literally look at the sound. So we pick out words and we talk about that they are examples of sounds that they've already learned. So we already talked about Y as a spelling for the sound E. And so we will look at sorry, very, plenty, happy. Now, I will also introduce some new sounds. So, for example, I might say to the learner, you know that Z is a spelling for the sound, or Z, sorry, the letter Z is a spelling for the sound Z. But sometimes this one, and I'll write the S on the board, is a spelling for the sound Z also. And then we will make the words like is, has, his, depending on their level. We might go a bit further, choose, tease, please. Okay. And so I go down through and I do what can only be described as a spelling analysis of that piece of reading. And that is how I apply a phonics mini lesson to a lesson which I'm already conducting in an ESOL class. Now, given the time, I'm kind of going to stop there and just ask if anybody has some questions. I'd love to go on forever. And just to say that I am very happy to share materials or examples of those analyses, which I just showed you or anything like that, if anybody wants. Okay. So I don't know, Fergus, do we have some questions already? Or
we have one. Let me see. Olga, could you unmute and just, I wasn't crystal clear about your question. Could you unmute and ask, please?
Hello, my name is Olga, and I'm originally from Ukraine, so I'm ESOL tutor. So, Michelle, we met in Dublin when, yes, you remember.
That's right, I do.
So impressed with your knowledge, with the and with ability of deliver all of this, and that actually exists. Because as not a native speaker, I find it's I want to master this for my students, to deliver this, because we weren't taught as the students when we were taught English, we weren't taught this, but it's right. so important. And we carry on this unusual or this accent that might be as well good to teach, because I know I'm kind of jumping here and there, my husband, he was American, Irish, and he was so frustrated to go to the hospital every time because he didn't understand what some of the doctors were saying. And it's not their fault, not doctors' fault, but the fault of the system, that the phonics weren't taught.
Mm, mm.
And I
Well,
find, and I just find you like a goddess in this, you know. So it's just the base, the foundation of English level in English language teaching. So thank you so much. And I can't thank you enough for developing this program and pushing this through. And well, I do recognize this really strongly, that it's such a necessity for it, for teaching.
wow, we can't say much fairer than that, Olga. That's wonderful, wonderful. I suppose I'd like to just make two very quick comments to that. Thank you very much, Olga. One of them is that has been my experience across the board, that it is the teachers who are coming up with this. It is the teachers who are approaching me going, this is great, this is what we want. It is the people who are sort of on the coalface, at the coalface, so to speak, who are experiencing the frustration. They are saying, you know, this would be useful. A useful, systematic, strategic approach is what we need. And also, just as a sort of a by the by, I did not develop this program specifically for this. I developed it as a reading tool. But one of the things that I have discovered is that many of our learners who really did have difficulty with pronunciation, especially maybe some of the older ones, actually are finding that this program is really helping them to focus on the sounds. And they're kind of going, you know, I have an appointment, because it's causing them to really focus on every single sound. So possibly more research might be required in the future into that, but it definitely seems to be one of the advantages.
Michelle, we've time for
We're
one
over
more
the
question.
time. Okay, one more, yeah.
I see a question there from Kira Lockman, and she's saying, would you mind briefly going over the sounds before letter?
The sounds before letter simply means that when I am presenting the information, I do not start by handing out a piece of paper or a worksheet. In other words, there is no visual stimulation. So I begin by saying, ah, we blend, ah, ah. And only when the learner has kind of achieved that particular skill, which might only take a few minutes, then I will write on the board. Then I will show them a picture. Equally, we write the word before we read the word. So it's a slightly counterintuitive method, but I have found that to be very effective. I cover all of that, I suppose, in greater detail at another time, maybe.
Okay, I know I said last question, but there's a few more coming in. So if anyone has to leave, they
Yeah.
can leave. Is that okay, Michelle?
I'm quite happy
more.
to talk on, and I do apologize. There was quite a lot to cover, so maybe I did talk for a little bit too long. I apologize.
No. As Olga said, you're a phonics goddess. It was you explained things so clearly. I absolutely loved it. I loved it. So Gemma has a question. Michelle, thanks for a brilliant presentation. Just wondering, what phonics scope and sequence do you use?
Okay, so there are many. And I wouldn't pretend that the one that I use is the only one. If you study websites, Australian, I kind of did quite a lot of research around the world for what was available. There are two that I kind of follow, and they're quite similar. And one of them came from a program which was developed in Ireland, actually, called Phonics Ireland. And that one I developed, I used initially. However, I also found some very good materials from Francis Woodward. All of this I can share with you afterwards, Fergus. And literally we are talking, I mean, we're right down to the kind of the nuts and bolts here. So Phonics Ireland would present, for example, they start with k, a, t, d, a, g in week 1. Whereas Francis's was, I think, more like the sat pin, s, at, in week 1. We're literally talking that level of differentiation, but they all follow CVCs followed by CCVCs, CVCCs, and so on. And that list I can also share with you, and I can provide lists of materials, lists of the sounds, lists of the words that go with the sounds, things like that, if you want, Fergus.
Yeah, if you send those to me, Michelle, I'll send to everyone who's registered for today.
Absolutely fine. Yeah.
Thanks. So 2 more questions. Gail
Yeah.
is asking, many thanks for this information. Can you direct us to other online printable resources?
I mean, I mentioned that
plan a blended learning,
I
blended
will
lesson.
certainly do my best to share, but having literally trawled the earth on the website, on the interweb at this stage, they're few and far between, adult friendly wise. So there's lots of phonics materials. The problem is trying to find ones that are appropriate, which is why I've actually started to develop some of my own. And that's what tutors often do. They end up kind of, oh, here, I'll just make up one myself. And I suppose we have been kind of built with the DDLETB, we've been kind of building a nice little library of materials. But to some extent, there are some materials, and I will share them. I would certainly recommend the Frances Woodward books. She has 2 books. One is called Phonics Stories for Older Learners, and the other one's called Phonics Resources for Older Learners. And I have that on my list of materials as well.
Okay, thanks.
I'd recommend those.
Gail, yeah, I'll send on everything that Michelle sends me.
Yeah.
Michelle Newell is saying, when are you going to put all this information into a book or manual? I think she's serious.
Well, I'll tell you, the answer is when I can find someone to pay me to do it, because I have 2 girlies in college, and it's all about trying to find what you love doing and then trying to find somebody to pay you to do it. Maybe when they start making earning their own keep.
Okay. And Paula says, absolutely brilliant presentation. Unfortunately, we have another meeting to go to, but love to contact Michelle directly.
You're very welcome to. Please do. You're very welcome to. I love hearing from people. Always about spreading the word.
Well, there's so many comments saying absolutely brilliant presentation, something along that line.
I'm glad.
So hold on, there's one here from Oksana has said, thank you for such a content-rich presentation, Michelle. Your articulation, presentation, and oratory skills are admirable. So that there's so much positive.
My head is just going to, I won't be able to get out the door. This is great.
Olga saying, is it possible to get access to your worksheets with word sentences and picture? Also, lesson plan based on not a big picture. Yeah, I'll send on the big picture stuff.
Yeah, I'm going to share those with Fergus. Okay. I've given them to Fergus. He's going to share them. Those are just samples, though. There are more. Yeah.
Michelle, can you call out your email again? One or two people are asking for your email.
So it's Michelle McGrain. Michelle McGrain it's at the first slide. It's on the first slide, which will be shared with you. The slides are going to be shared with you. But it's Michelle McGrain at ddletbaes.ie. It's a bit ridiculously long. It's Dublin Dún Laoghaire Adult Education Service.
Don't worry, I'll send the presentation now, and on slide 1, Michelle's email's there. So Anna's saying, brilliant. Thank you for showing us samples of worksheets. So we're going to have to leave it there, folks.
Great to get the feedback. Yeah, great to get the lovely feedback.
Michelle, I thought it was a brilliant presentation. I loved it.
Thank you so much.
Years ago, I taught ESOL, and I didn't understand. I hadn't the confidence to use phonics, and
that was my experience too. That was many of our experiences. We started off and then we met these students and we just didn't feel equipped. And that's where I started. That was where my research started. I was like, we have to find a way. And I should also at this moment give a shout out to Bernie McGinley, who you will know, Fergus, very well, because she really was my inspiration in the beginning, Bernie said to me, I'm going to do a course. Are you going to do it, Michelle? Which was Bernie's great way of making you do things during the summer.
And Siobhan O'Brien, you only need to email me if you want the big picture stuff. I'll send that to you by, it's online, isn't it? We don't have it in book form anymore. But Michelle's resources, her presentation resources, she's already sent them to me, and I'll send them to everybody who registered for this morning.
And I'm happy to travel for training as well if people want to organize training days for their tutors. Love it. Love all that.
So if you love this and you want Michelle to go to your ETB, just tell your ALO Michelle is a goddess of phonics. We need her in our ETB
Fergus, will you
now.
be expecting a commission for this now?
You're freaking brilliant. So, you know, feel free to tell your ESOL coordinator or your ALO or whoever it is who organizes training that Michelle is happy to travel and deliver workshops where you are, or webinars, Michelle, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
absolutely.
whichever suits you and your ETB and your colleagues, or if you're in another setting teaching ESOL, Michelle is available. As I said, her email address is in the first line of her presentation. Okay, I just see, is there anything else? Yeah, everyone's just saying thanks so much, Michelle. You were brilliant. That's just, you were brilliant, and your presentation was brilliant.
I'm glad it was useful.
Okay, everyone. Thanks, Michelle. You were class, and everyone else have a great weekend. And thanks for logging in. Thanks, Michelle Reed, as well, for helping.
Bye-bye. Thanks to everyone.
And I have recorded this, and I will put it up on the Nala YouTube channel next week sometime. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye to all. Bye-bye.